This week, the Biden administration ordered changes to the language used to describe people crossing the border into the U.S. Immigration agencies such as ICE will have to change their language, but what does this really mean? And why are they being mandated to do so now? With over 20,000 unaccompanied minors crossing into the U.S. since Biden took office, what is the reality along the border today? Joining me now to discuss this and much more is former Health and Human Services Chief of Staff under the Trump administration, Brian Harrison. Brian, I want to begin with these changes in language the Biden administration has put forth for Border Patrol and ICE. They will now refer to aliens as non-citizens or migrants. Illegal will become undocumented. Assimilation will be switched to civic integration. What do you make of these changes, and what effect does this have, if any?
Yeah, it's just a continuation of the Biden administration's longstanding attempt to sort of sugarcoat the problems that they are creating. I mean, how long are we into the Biden administration now? Multiple months with the crisis they have at the border. But you'll notice you're talking about some of the recent changes in terminology, but they have yet even to use the correct term, which is crisis. I mean, they won't say that. And so what they're doing here is they're simply creating these new terms for the illegal aliens that are coming here. They won't let us call them what they are. And they're doing it across the board, not just by not acknowledging it's a crisis on the border, but also renaming the facilities. I mean, if President Trump were still president, and if, when I was the chief of staff for him at HHS and we had oversaw these migrant shelters, they accused us in the media of running concentration camps. If you recall, it was kids in cages was almost 24/7 on the screens. And now you don't hardly ever see that from the mainstream media. They're renaming that too. Now they're reception sites or decompression zones. I mean, I oversaw these facilities. I've never heard these terms in my life. So I don't know what they're doing here.
Well, he who controls the language controls the story. More than 23,000 migrant children, Brian, are currently in government custody as of this week, and 10,500 plus sleeping on cots at convention centers and military bases. As you said, these welcome centers, I guess they're calling them now. Does HHS have the capacity to properly care for these children and the many that are still coming? Is the HHS equipped to handle a crisis of this magnitude?
Yeah, as the former chief of staff at HHS, I can tell you they are out of capacity. Absolutely not. And let's back up just a little bit and give some history here and some context. When President Trump was the president and when the Trump administration, those of us were there, and we had a small migrant surge, we took the problem seriously. President Trump wanted that border secure. He took swift and decisive actions to solve the problem once and for all. He was building the wall. He had ended catch and release. He had to remain in Mexico. And then us at HHS, we used our public health authorities when COVID hit to say this is the worst possible time to have thousands of illegal immigrants carrying COVID-19 pouring our borders. So we put up Title 42 order that shut the border down coast to coast once and for all, allowed for immediate deportations, and kept the United States secure. All Joe Biden had to do was absolutely nothing when he took office, because President Trump left him the most secure border in our nation's history. And what you're talking about is all these shelters that are housing these illegal immigrants that are under 18, these 15, 16, 17-year-old teenage boys. The reason you're seeing that is because he didn't, when he came into office, President Biden, he didn't take down our Title 42 order. He left it in place, but he is illegally disregarding it. He's not adhering to it and not enforcing it for every illegal under 18. And that's what's causing the surge at the border, and why you're seeing these thousands and thousands of migrants in these shelters under 18, causing a public health crisis and a humanitarian crisis. It's totally inhumane what he's doing. It's illegal. It's why I filed suit against him in federal court about 3 or 4 weeks ago to force him to resecure the border. And in fact, I'll tell you this, when I left on my last day as President Trump's chief of staff at HHS, we had excess capacity in these facilities, and we had COVID protections in place to make sure there was sufficient spacing to make sure these sites didn't become what we're seeing now, which is super spreaders. So the media, the Democrats, they called the Trump administration inhumane on the border. They are the ones that are ending Trump-era COVID protections to make sure that we protect both American citizens and those who are in these shelters. And now they're building up new shelters by the day, thousands of new beds coming online, and they're creating COVID super spreader events right here in my backyard in Texas.
Wow. $60 million a week, we should add, in housing these young migrants. I mean, the price tag of this is simply unbelievable, to say nothing of the enormous humanitarian crisis and health crisis that we're seeing at the border. Last month, Biden tapped Vice President Harris to handle this border crisis. Now, she's expected to meet virtually with the president of Guatemala next week and travel to the Northern Triangle in June. What do you think she needs to do here? And is this simply an effort to reestablish the stay in Mexico policy that was already in place months ago?
You know, I could not believe it. I heard the other day President Biden talking about how he had tasked his vice president to work with Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries to see if they could handle the asylum claims in a very similar way to the way we had him in the Trump administration. And because this came right on the heels of him tearing up and trashing the Remain in Mexico and the safe third nation agreements that we had already set in place. So again, all he had to do was nothing. He scrapped our successes and is now trying to take credit for like maybe thinking about starting to take some of the same actions that we had already taken in the Trump administration. And speaking of Vice President Harris, I mean, she's nominally in charge of the border. When is she going to go to the border and see what's going on? When are they going to let press cameras through there? That's another thing. The media and the Democrats always attacked the Trump administration and us at HHS for being not transparent. We were completely transparent. I can't even tell you how many reporters we sent through those facilities. I believe it was in the hundreds. I personally went to one of these facilities, migrant shelters at the border, with our fantastic First Lady, Melania Trump. And also talking about Kamala Harris, it wasn't even, I don't think, 2 years ago. She was out literally protesting and picketing some of these facilities because she was upset over licensure issues. And now her boss, President Biden, and her are opening thousands and thousands and thousands of unlicensed beds. There is no limit to the hypocrisy here. And if it weren't so serious, it might be comical, but it's genuinely tragic. It's a humanitarian crisis. They created it. They did it on purpose, and they've got to be stopped.
Arizona's governor declared a state of emergency this week. He announced he's sending 250 National Guards to help local law enforcement with the crisis at the border. Should this be necessary? And are you surprised by the lack of coverage and outrage by what's happening in these border towns?
Well, I'm surprised by the lack of coverage and outrage by the media. But again, the media is just doing a massive cover-up operation for the Democrats that control the White House and the House of Representatives right now. Border security is one of the few things that the Constitution clearly enumerates should be managed by the federal government. I'm a very small government person. I'm running for Congress to maximize individual liberty and freedom. But one of the few responsibilities the federal government has is to keep our borders secure. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are being completely derelict in their duties. And so the burden, unfortunately, is falling to some of these southern border states' governors who are having to step up and pick up the slack where the federal government, under the liberal Democrats with their open border policies, is failing America.
Brian, I only have a minute. I want to play this for you. This is former President George W. Bush talking about the need for immigration reform. Listen.
The system really needs to be reformed and fixed. Two things I think will help alleviate that. One is an asylum process that is more robust. In other words, the border is being overwhelmed right now, and there needs to be more judges and more courts so people can have a fair hearing. And secondly, we need to change the work visas.
Your thoughts on these comments?
Yeah, so I think that we, as the United States, we are a place where people who legitimately need to seek refuge should be able to come. And people who want to immigrate to the United States should be able to do so, but legally. But the problem is with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi and their open border policies, they are not allowing us to focus on what really should be our attention, which is setting an America First immigration policies, letting the right numbers of folks come here and for the right reasons. When you create a disaster, and that's what this is, it's a crisis, it's a national disaster completely of Joe Biden's making on the border, you refocus and unfortunately don't allow us to have the types of discussions we should be having about what should be the proper immigration policy for the United States, an immigration policy that benefits American citizens and American workers and the American economy, because we're right now completely distracted trying to put together and fix and solve a humanitarian crisis on our border that they created. Until we get the border secured, we're not ever going to be able to appropriately handle those types of issues that were raised in that clip.
Brian Harrison, thank you for being here and for your insight.
You bet. Thanks for having me.